Can I say first off a hand for Steve Markle, the filmmaker who made these incredible films. They've provoked us, they've shocked us, they've moved us, they've really just been terrific, including this one that's great. I'm Jean Meserve. I'm a former anchor and correspondent for CNN. Now I'm a senior fellow at George Washington University Center for Cyber and Homeland Security. Pleased to be back here to talk about terror financing today. You'll remember that after 9/11, the clarion call was, let's follow the money. If we follow the money, we're going to find the terrorists, we'll be able to disrupt their networks. Well, that didn't turn out so well, did it? As you saw from that video. Right now, London has been proclaimed the money laundering capital of the world, and we're facing the best financed terrorist army we ever have in the Middle East. So we've assembled a great panel here to talk today. Let me introduce them. At the far end, starting at my far right, is Ambassador Hussein Haqqani. He's the former ambassador from Pakistan to the US. He is current director for South and Central Asia at the Hudson Institute. Thanks for being here. Falu Mustafa is here. He is the head of the Department of Foreign Relations for the Kurdistan Regional Government. Thank you. Cindy McCain is here as well. Cindy is well known to all of us, I'm sure. She is co-chair of the Arizona Task Force on Human Trafficking. She's also a member of the McCain Institute's Human Trafficking Advisory Council. And Ayman Mahana is here with me as well. Ayman is executive director of the Samir Kassir Foundation. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to start with you. There has been a lot of talk in the course of this session about the intersection between criminal gangs and terrorist organizations. Some wise person in this room, and I'd credit you if I remember who it was, said that essentially what we have here are criminal gangs that have found religion. Is that how you'd characterize them?
Well, let's just remember that there has always been a nexus between crime and terrorism. I mean, the IRA ran organized crime in the United States to be able to fund its activities. The LTTE, the Tamil Tigers of Sri Lanka, did that. And so the Islamist terrorists are no different. We must remember, Al-Qaeda didn't start out with being a criminal operation. They actually raised money by donations. And of course, their biggest and most expensive operation was the 9/11 attacks, about $500,000, $450,000. But since then, and then you must remember that the Taliban, while they were ruling Afghanistan under the influence of Al-Qaeda, actually suppressed the drug trade. But after 9/11, the Islamist groups have seriously got into this. And here's my explanation for that. For one thing, if you're a street thug or a street criminal in Belgium or France, you do want some respectability. There's no respectability for a street criminal. But if you are fighting for a cause and you claim that you have a connection with a cause, then you become respectable. Just like the Irish mob in Boston respectabilized itself by connecting it to the IRA. So no, it's not criminals who have found religion. It's criminals plus terrorists, and they feed off each other. And the video was really great because it explained every possible source of where the money comes from. But it's not just in the Middle East. And Mrs. McCain would probably address that question when she speaks to us. But for example, child trafficking. Child trafficking and proceeds from it actually help small insurgencies and terrorist groups in Southeast Asia. And so this is a global problem. The problem is, capitalism makes us all greedy, and the terrorists take advantage of that. I have never met a banker who will turn away a large bag of money just because he thinks it's tainted money.
So given this nexus, is there enough cooperation between law enforcement and counterterrorism?
Well, the problem here is that the instinct of most governments is to fund their armies before they fund law enforcement. So for example, the FBI got its new computers and the Department of Homeland Security got its more updated equipment much after the buildup of the US military. In some countries, there isn't enough money for law enforcement. Look, if we're going to stop all of this, we have to stop it there as much as here. So here, you know, we will get an apology from Bank of America or Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank for the money laundering. They did just a few $1 billion, sorry about that. And they might get a fine, you know, $4 billion in fine after negotiations. Hardly anyone goes to jail. But in our countries, for example, in Pakistan, the military gets all the money. So, for example, US aid, we get F-16s, which are big ticket items. But when it comes to getting the police in Karachi, walkie-talkies, there isn't enough money. And so law enforcement is very weak. I'm sure the Kurdish minister will be able to tell you how they don't have enough money for their law enforcement. And so law enforcement in many of the countries where the problem is originating is far weaker. And I think what we need to do is put law enforcement into counterterrorism strategies alongside building up the military capabilities of different countries.
Ayman, I want to ask you, a lot of the effort internationally has focused on the banking community, and though there have been some successes, as the video pointed out, a lot of failures too. You have an observation about the fact that in many cases, at least in your part of the world, they don't need the banking system, the international banking system, correct? Tell us about that.
Definitely, there is a difference between ISIS and all other terrorist organizations that the world has known, is that it's a territorial organization. There are between 7 to 10 million people living under ISIS-controlled territory, which means that on a daily basis, these people have to go to the shops, try to get married, raise their kids. So a local economy is absolutely needed on the ground. Some of the money that ISIS has collected through all the different channels that were shown in the video, of course, are used to help the people. For example, there is a marriage fund. There is a housing fund that is also connected to the things that are appropriated after they attack some regions and they expropriate some of the old owners. But what ISIS managed to do is to relieve itself from some of these expenses through aid that would come from foreign donors, for example.
How big a factor is that?
I can't give you numbers, but something like Tajhiz al-Ghazi, which is equipping a soldier. So instead of ISIS itself paying for the equipment and the money that goes for a certain fighter coming from abroad or locally, they have sponsors specifically for this. Same thing for other forms of charities where charities would come and take care of some specific people. The banking issue is absolutely important. In Iraq, we learned that the central government banned transfers to banks inside ISIS-controlled territories. But it's so porous, it's so easy to have banking transactions just on the borders. Whereas in Syria, and this is extremely important and it shows the double game of Bashar al-Assad, banks operating inside ISIS territory are still branches connected to Damascus and still receiving all the wire transfers without any problem. Same thing for government workers in Syria.
Isn't it largely a cash economy? I mean, you have them charging taxes on people, collecting ransoms on people. Some of that is just cash.
It is, but at the same time, specifically in Syria, banks are still playing an important role. Every time someone wants to withdraw some cash from an ATM or directly from the teller, there is a cutoff that ISIS takes. So they are really happy that there are still financial connections between the banks in Damascus, which have correspondents in Lebanon and other countries, in Cyprus, that are still operating inside ISIS territory.
Minister Mustafa, oil is the big revenue producer for ISIS. I've seen estimates of $1 million a day that they're bringing in because of this. Recently, more airstrikes have been targeting the oil infrastructure. Is it having an effect, as far as you can see?
Certainly, the airstrikes have been effective and have destroyed many of the oil facilities and infrastructure. But oil is not the only source of money that comes to them. And of course, the local population help them in getting that, and also countries in the neighborhood. That's why we have to make sure that there is cooperation, because when somebody sells, there is a buyer.
Yes.
If there is no buyer, the seller cannot sell.
So are governments complicit in this?
I cannot talk about governments being complicit, but we have to make sure that we work hard enough in order to stop them being able to do so. There has been a huge difference between last year and this year, but still it's happening. On the issue of the banks, we as a regional government, we have 14 representations abroad. We try to send them their budget. We face a lot of challenges and difficulties through the banks. I don't know how ISIS is able to get all that money from charities, from individuals coming, not only going to Syria and Iraq, but also remittances to be sent back through Hawala system to their families.
Hawala has come down quite a bit, but since he's still in government and I'm not, I can talk a little more frankly. Governments are complicit in the sense that
you want to name them?
There is a tendency on the part of governments not to try and suppress the so-called black economy because it augments the overall economy. If your economic performance is not that good, I know that from my own country, it's estimated that almost sort of the size of Pakistan's black economy is equal to the size of the official economy. Now, the government has no interest in completely shutting it down because then it will create serious political and social problems. And social services are often the excuse because, of course, terrorist groups need social services to legitimize themselves. But quite often, buyers would argue, look, I'm getting a barrel of oil at $40 from ISIS. The market is $140. I'm saving money. And plus, I'm hoping that the money I'm giving is only going to that part of ISIS which is providing the social services. After all, those 7 million people have to be fed. And we've heard this social services business all the way from Hezbollah to Pakistan's Lashkar-e-Taiba. Oh, they do such good social service. Well, guess what? The social service also provides the way of actually cooking the books when it comes to revenue from things like oil sales.
Ms. McCain, a lot of people don't think of human trafficking as being a big money generator for terrorist groups. Is it?
Oh my gosh, it's enormous. Human trafficking alone accounts for, and I don't like throwing numbers around, but it accounts for approximately 30 million people each year being moved around systematically in an organized fashion and being sold over and over and over again. That's a great business model, by the way, when you can sell something over and over and over. It's also something that's mistakenly thought of, and this is why it's so imperative that the United States play a huge role in this. For a long time, the folks in my country thought it didn't happen there, that it happened only some other place. It does happen. It happens in all of our countries. We've seen it everywhere. You've sat next to it on a plane. You've seen it in a bus station. You've touched it. You just didn't know what it was. So from a U.S. standpoint, it's extraordinarily important to be involved in this because it's a huge problem domestically for us.
But do governments turn a blind eye to this as well?
I don't think the government has necessarily turned a blind eye. It's up to folks like myself and others to make people understand what the issue is. At home in Arizona, we call it the good old boy network, and that's a lot of what this is about, is a good old boy network. It's viewed as something that women want to do. That's not the case. They're not viewed as victims. They're viewed as prostitutes, or they like it and they're disposable anyway, no big deal. I mean, we're talking many, many, many cases, children, babies being trafficked for sex.
Mrs. McCain hosted a dinner last night on this topic, and one of the things that came up is that when it comes to the refugees who are pouring out of Syria, that some people perceive them as actually playing a role, the smugglers, that other mechanisms for moving people out of conflict zones, or obviously stopping the conflict, aren't working. So they actually are providing a value. How do you counter that argument, or do you counter that argument?
Well, part of the refugee problem, a major part of the refugee problem, first of all, let me back, we're concentrating specifically on the plight of the refugees, as we should. This is a terrible circumstance, and governments and people need to be not only involved in it, but they need to take a lead on this. The EU and others need to take a lead on this. But part of the problem in this is that we're ignoring the traffickers, the guys that are actually doing it. And we talk a great deal about that, but that's where, as we talked about in our last discussion, where some of the technology and things could come into play. But it takes organization. I've never seen a more disorganized issue than human trafficking. Nobody works together on it. It's very frustrating for those of us who are on the ground.
Jean, just as in everything, just as there's a supply there's also a demand.
Demand, yes.
And so, for example, we know that in case of Africa, conflicts have actually come down after Western countries, which were where the demand was for diamonds, the conflict diamonds was the term used. Once governments and others started cracking down on it, there was a social stigma attached to having conflict diamonds, you know, and people started thinking about, where is my diamond coming from? You know, it is forever, it is coming from the guy I really love, but do I really want a diamond? And just changing the term, instead of conflict diamonds, they started being called blood diamonds. And it changed things in Africa. Now, just to give an example, we were just discussing, Mrs. McCain and myself in the green room, about how in Cambodia, or in Myanmar, there are all these tourist hotels which are essentially just, and they are basically advertised as the places where you will be able to get an underage girl. Now,
or child.
Or a child.
Boy.
But you're not going to stop the demand for oil. You're not going to stop the demand for drugs.
So, yes.
Which are two of the other things fueling terrorism.
Absolutely. And in case of, well, and there are those who would argue that oil fuels terrorism in more than one ways. And we've already beaten that horse to death over the last couple of days. I'm not going to bring that up again, but such an oil-rich countries, I mean, would Iran be the menace it has become if it didn't have oil? If it was a non-oil country, it wouldn't have been the issue that it has become. It couldn't have funded Hezbollah endlessly, etc. And certain other countries in the Middle East. So yes, the point is that it needs to be done at both ends. And I think, for example, in case of oil, okay, in diamonds, you could figure out a way of figuring out what diamond is coming from where. I don't know what the technical basis is. I'm not a diamond expert. We did give one diamond to my wife at the time of our engagement, but that's my sum total of expertise in diamonds. I remember the price.
We'll add it to the video.
Yeah.
But in case of oil, you can't mark oil, and you can't have any marker from where the oil is coming. However, the good thing about oil is oil can't be transported in a handbag. So oil has to go in containers or whatever they are, tankers. Oil has, and that can be monitored. My point is, global law enforcement is lagging in terms of understanding its function in counterterrorism. Global law enforcement in counterterrorism is only focused on finding the next potential terrorist who will attack in Brussels. It isn't following the money as it ought to, and we've had more than a decade. We could have done it. We still can.
Societies play a major role in that, and also the community, educating the people. Last year, we have suffered a huge tragedy at the hands of the brutal terrorist organization of ISIS when the Yazidi women were taken, enslaved, sex enslaved, and they were raped. But the reaction of the society was great, that we have considered them as victims. No one looked down upon them. And even last week or so, when Sinjar was liberated, President Barzani made sure that the Yazidi women are the symbol of our honor, and they live with dignity, and they can be proud of that. Therefore, the reaction of the community is important, how to look at them. Culturally, we have to educate them. The law enforcement is important, but governments alone cannot do it. Civil society, women's organizations, the media can play an important role in stopping this, because really it is happening. Or even the labor market. There are labor that is being brought to Iraq and Kurdistan, and mainly Kurdistan, or to the Gulf areas from Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, these people who are the traders or the companies abuse them and exploit them. They bring them by the name of coming to Kurdistan, which is safe and secure. People try to sell them for better prices or higher prices and send them to Baghdad, which is insecure, or other parts of the country. Or they ask them to do extra work for the same money if they don't do it. So there have to be some rules and regulations in regulating the labor market. When women have been brought in order to do a certain type of work, immediately they take their passports. When they take their passport, they would become slaves. They cannot leave that job. That's why we have approached those governments who have got their nationals in Kurdistan. We told them, let's have memorandum of understanding to regulate this labor force as a proper labor force for people to live and work with dignity.
I'd like to focus again on the stigma aspect that's so important to tackle the demand side. It can be applied definitely to human trafficking as it was to diamond, but then there is definitely the issue of antiquities. Antiquities in Syria and Iraq have been looted, sold on international markets through trafficking networks. But now, ISIS is even somehow regulating the smuggling market by actually taxing the smugglers on with a certain amount of money, depending from 20 to 50% of the value, depending on the provenance of the antiquities and the artifacts and their quality. What's important here is definitely to develop a system where stigma is on the buyer and where the buyer will have to define where these things came from. And very often, when we manage to identify smugglers, for example, working in in antiquities, there is a high probability that they are extremely connected to the ones who are trafficking oils and trafficking all other forms of good. Phosphate, sulfur, cement, wheat, all these products are being smuggled through these routes. So probably taking one thread will lead to destroying the whole sweater.
The gang leaders, the people who engage in drug smuggling, for example, child trafficking, etc., they often take advantage of the non-existence of extradition treaties. I think that's another area that we need to put our minds to. Maybe these are things that can be covered by international law rather than by individual treaties of extradition, that on certain things, yes. I think child trafficking, and this is something Mrs. McCain could actually start a campaign for, that for example, for child trafficking, etc., there should be no need for an individual extradition law, but maybe a UN treaty can cover the extradition under that, because there are safe havens, let's be honest. I remember from my time in government, we had, Pakistan and the United States doesn't have an extradition treaty. And the biggest market for Pakistani heroin at that time was the United States. And heroin was coming, many people had been arrested, etc. But in many cases, the leaders of the cartels were located in Pakistan. Within Pakistan, they were located in our tribal areas, which have a different legal system than the rest of the country. So they actually knew all their legal advantages while engaging in this huge global racket of criminal activity. And that is something where the law, I would insist that the law and law enforcement are several steps behind those who are engaging in the criminal activity.
We don't live in an ideal world. We have to work for it. We have to react to it in order to bring solutions. But just talking about the problems is not enough. For example, we talk about women. We have to empower women. We have to educate them. We have to give them the opportunity in the society. You mentioned the UN. The head of the UN women in Iraq is a man. So what do you expect for a traditional, culturally society in order to send an active woman to represent women? He is a man representing the UN women. So that's why we need to do much more work to provide work opportunities, to empower them, to give them the opportunity to be in the leadership, to give the teenagers or those who are graduates opportunity to work in order to address these issues, to have a roadmap and a plan for action.
Ms. McCain, you want to weigh in?
There's several points here, actually. One of the issues that I think we in the United States need to seriously look at is our process of rewarding bad behavior. Countries that have serious human rights issues with regards to women and children, we are not, when our country sometimes, when they talk to the folks that are in charge and the presidents or whoever they may be, it's the wrong people to talk to because they're the ones that are either funding or profiting from it. At some point, I think our value system, and we've talked a lot about our value system this week, our value system should dictate that we don't necessarily throw over billions of dollars in foreign aid until we get the result that we want. And when it comes to children, I think that should be first on the list. And that's exactly what we're talking about.
Is that realistic politically?
I don't know. I'm not a politician.
That's very the other close
guy.
To one, however.
That's the other guy. I don't know if it's realistic, but I tell you, we're going to have to look at something that does do something like that, because we just simply cannot continue to say, okay, it's all right. You're doing really terrible things and you're selling children and it's child abuse, but that's okay. We'll go ahead and give you the money.
Did you want to name names? You mentioned there were some countries where...
There are some countries, Cambodia being one of them, that I'm very frustrated with because they talk a great game and they turn their back. And forgive me if any Cambodians are in the room, but it's the truth.
strategically important countries are very difficult to deal with again.
Yes.
So, for example, you could actually bring Manuel Noriega of Panama to trial for being involved in drug trafficking. But could you do the same for a strategically located ally where you have troops or another ally who provides the lines of communications for your troops if one of their leaders was involved in drugs? And you probably wouldn't be able to do it, but all I would say is that there are many things we can't do in the world. But then just because we can't do them now doesn't mean putting them off the table so far that we can't do them when we can do them. My fear is that sometimes this realistic argument of, you know, it can't be done realistically now makes us switch off. It puts that issue off our minds completely. And all I'm asking for is that in certain cases, just keep it in mind. Remember that these are our priorities and that you can come to those priorities. All of us do that in our normal lives. We can't fulfill all our priorities, but we do remember them. And I think that some of these issues are often forgotten by leaders. I mean, you know, after the war against terrorism, drug trafficking was forgotten. Afghanistan, you've heard about it. You read about the instructions that were given to American military officers in Afghanistan. Don't interfere with the quote-unquote culture of pedophilia in certain parts of eastern Afghanistan. Why give those instructions? You know, I mean, okay, you may not be able to do it because the person is an important warlord and he's your ally and he is the greatest pedophile in the province. But then by saying in writing to your military commanders and officers that you shouldn't interfere with this because it's a cultural practice, A, it's an insult to the Afghans and their culture, and to those Afghans who really don't think it is a cultural practice and who don't like it. But B, it actually is a surrender of your values. And so don't keep surrendering the values even in terms of argument just based on this it can't be realistically done argument. So you have to have a realization of what can be realistically done. I am realistic enough to understand there are certain allies you can't take on, there are certain criminals you can't arrest, there are certain issues you can't tackle right away. But forgetting about them is an even greater problem because it won't help you solve it when you do come into a position where you can solve it.
Well, if you support the rule of law, that would help to address all these issues.
Absolutely.
I'd love to take some audience questions. Mr. McKay, let me bring this microphone right over to you.
Well, this is a fascinating, overdue topic for discussion here at Halifax, and I want to thank all the panelists. One of the magic elements of Halifax is solutions and enablers. And what we're seeing here, I think, are some really concrete ideas, one of which Mr. Haqqani has spoken about, the connectivity and the importance of getting things like Interpol. And we have an organization in Canada called the Centre for Child Protection. So much of what Ms. McCain is talking about is happening over the internet. It's prolific. We're seeing a rise in child pornography and child exploitation in our country, and I think that this mirrors what's happening in many places. So we don't have to reinvent some of the agencies that are out there. We just have to get them more plugged in to combat what's happening in the world and what's happening in particular with women and children. This idea of how we enable some of these organizations to combat almost requires, I dare say it, a NATO-type approach for law enforcement.
Absolutely.
We again have something in Canada with our Judge Advocate General, and our Judge Advocate General is here, that allows us to go after what are sometimes deemed military targets, but they're actually criminals. I would far rather, in some ways, have seen Osama bin Laden dragged before the Hague and treated like an Al Capone and rotting in a jail somewhere rather than being murdered. And so I'd just like to maybe get some of your thoughts on how we bring some of these practical connectivities together to combat what is absolutely the most abominable crime there is, exploitation of children in particular, the most vulnerable. And I couldn't agree more that it has to be at the top of a priority. How do we generate more outrage from world leaders and get more attention on this issue? And I commend you for your leadership on this.
Ms. McCain, you and I talked about this last night.
Yeah, we did. We did. You know, number one, this is a tough issue to talk about. And in the circles that I run in, A lot of times they're, oh my God, she's coming in the room, run the other way, because we know what she's going to talk about today. The coordinated efforts that we need to, like you were just suggesting, a NATO force of some kind, whatever it may be, a coordination is the key to this. We have been able to halt some of the banking issues in that we've disabled the ability to use credit cards on some of these websites that sell these kids anonymously. That's a huge step for us, but yet we still are dealing with Bitcoin and all the other facets of this that make it very difficult. The key to this is coordinated efforts, in my opinion.
And you indicated that there are some ways technology is now being used to actually try and thwart this.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, there's some great organizations out there that have produced and are producing software programs that are great enablers for our first responders who are actually on the ground looking for these kids. It takes the information, the pictures, the phone numbers, all the different, the possible addresses, et cetera, and braids them together. And through that, you're able to see a pattern, and patterns are what this is all about. If you can predict, then we can intervene on this. But it's, you know, Thorn is one of them. Thorn, if you do not know who Thorn is, I suggest you pull them up on the internet. They're amazing.
And we have another question right here. Please tell us
your name. Thank you. My name is Jafet Omojua, a blogger from Nigeria. I think we're paying too much attention to what we're seeing right now, the current problems. We are not looking at what is coming. I'm saying that because Africa, throughout the sessions that have happened, for instance, Africa has been more or less an any other business conversation. It's not been at the center of the conversation. And if we don't shine the light on Africa, really and truly, the problems we're facing today with terrorism, they are going to be like a child's play to the future that is coming. 70% of that continent are under 30. By 2040, it's going to have the highest population of working people. It means that if those people are not well taken care of, the world has to take care of them one way or the other. We need to start looking at, for instance, 54 countries, the banking system. Boko Haram killed more people than ISIS last year. The number one deadliest terrorist group in the world is in Nigeria. The fourth deadliest is in Nigeria. Al-Shabaab is making progress in Somalia. What can we do, not just about the current problems we're seeing, but about the ones that are coming, the ones that are in places where we are pretending don't exist?
And can you tell us how these groups are financing themselves?
More or less the same way. Boko Haram took about 219 girls in Nigeria last year. They still haven't been found. Even though the rest of the world knew about those girls, they took several more people, and they keep, you know, the Nigerian government has done a lot of work in suppressing them, but these are other ways. They also kidnap foreigners, expatriates, and make money off them. But more or less the same way the video expatiated. Thank you.
It's absolutely true that Africa doesn't get enough attention, and then there are other parts of the world that don't get attention, and then there are problems that don't get attention. So I fully agree with you that there is a tendency. So going back to my earlier point, it's much easier, for example, to build a NATO-like organization. Guess what? The American political leadership was vested in trying to build NATO, and so were the European leaders and Canadian leaders. Can they put the same kind of, take the same kind of interest in creating the global networks of law enforcement, which are much weaker, much less funded? Similarly, we all know that there is a problem coming out in Africa, and it's not just Africa. There are other younger countries as well, but I agree, Africa will have one of the largest pools of young people. India is another, you know, and the attention that is given to them is marginal because, very frankly, the West is still very Eurocentric, and the Middle East gets attention because it's close enough to the West and creates enough irritants for the West, and then there is the factor of oil. So, which in case of Africa will also be important because Africa is going to be an oil-producing region for a large part. I think that basically we just need to broaden both our range of issues that we focus on and regions that we focus on. I would wholeheartedly support that approach.
These problems are not confined to one geographic area. Right. They are happening in developing and underdeveloped world. Therefore, there has to be a global approach to tackle.
And people are learning from one another. For example, hostage taking was originally, it was a great success for the Haqqani network, the ill-named Haqqani network. Ill-named because they stole my family name, you know, because it just has a very good meaning. Their real name was Zadrani, remember that one. It's difficult to pronounce, that's why the Haqqani became more popular. But the Haqqani network was the first one to start hostage taking way back. In fact, one of their former hostages is probably in the audience. And they were trying to demand money from the people that they kidnapped from. And they did raise a lot of money, and there are a lot of Pakistani businessmen they kidnapped. There are a lot of some Westerners in Afghanistan that they kidnapped. They still have some hostages which have completely been forgotten. And so they started it, and one of the first things ISIS started doing was hostage taking as a means of raising money.
And it's my duty to raise the awareness always and repeat that are today up to 9 journalists, foreign journalists who are still in custody, detained in Syria, 8 by ISIS, 1 by the Syrian government, and in addition to a huge number of local journalists and non-journalists, of course, businessmen. And this is one of the major also sources of funding. I mean, it's hard to talk about it, but if we look at what happened in 2014, on the 3rd of March, Marc Marginedas from Spain is freed. On the 30th of March, Javier Espinoza and another Spanish journalist. A few weeks later, the 4 French journalists were released, and then early June, the Danish journalist is released. A few days later, the attack on Mosul. Yes, there is no direct link, but what about the cash? Was that cash also an enabler of a broader attack?
You know, so what do we do about this question of ransom? You know, the U.S. government has said for a long time, won't pay it. But other governments clearly are. Well,
and it's not just governments. Sometimes it's families. Yes. Sometimes it's organizations. What does a news organization do? Do we want to have... I think, I mean, I'm not a law enforcement person, so I don't really have a solution for saying, but look, there used to be hostage takings in this country. I mean, if I remember that Patty Hearst thing, you know, the Symbionese Liberation Army was trying to raise money by kidnapping somebody. So it's something that has existed. I think it operates much more successfully in areas that are poorly governed or do not have a central government or do not have a law-abiding government. It's much more likely there in Syria, in ISIS areas. It used to happen in Lebanon too, by the way, enormously. And then it's happening in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So poorly governed areas, so then we know that that's a problem. We need to figure that out. Technology, I mean, there are technological ways of being able to track people, find them. That should be attempted. I am not the right person to know the details of what can be done, but it has to be dealt with. It has to be dealt with because the temptation to engage in it on a large scale to be able to get the money for other things is just too great.
But ISIS has been taking money from people even before the fall of Mosul. In 2013, our leadership warned Baghdad that this is coming, when we knew that during the night, the western part of Iraq and the eastern part of Syria were not under the control of the government on both sides of the border, and they were levying taxes and collecting money. It's not only the trading the oil, it's not only the ransom, the kidnapping, but also they were levying taxes on local population. And now they are running the show because they control territory. They declare themselves as a state, whether you like it or not, and they call it the Islamic State. So therefore, somebody has to come up to prove that it is not that Islamic State. So they have a state, they have a system of governance, they provide services their own way, but they have got money.
We have another question back here. You have the microphone. Go ahead.
Oh. Yes, sorry. Heather Ruff, the University of Oxford and Arizona State. Arizona State University. And I have a quick question. We talk a lot about ISIS and we talk a lot about criminal networks and everything else, but one thing that doesn't get brought to attention, I think, enough is that sometimes you need to guard the guardians, and you have a huge amount of black markets erupting when United Nations peacekeeping forces come into play. And so you have a huge amount of trafficking actually happen of women and children when UN peacekeepers are doing the trafficking. So I'm wondering what the panel might have to say when the guardians themselves aren't guarding those who they should be protecting. Thank you.
Anyone want to tackle that?
Well, they are human beings, just like others. There are war traders that they want to make money.
I also think they need to be, in the case, and I'll use the case of DRC Congo. Yeah. They need to be, not only attention being drawn to it, but they need to be thrown out and replaced. To tolerate troops doing that to the local population that they're supposed to be protecting is unconscionable. And in many cases, in the case of DRC Congo, they did not throw them out. They kept them there.
And it's government not necessarily playing that role. So yes, we can hide it behind a big title like trafficking, etc., to talk as if it's too huge to tackle. But when it comes, for example, to UN soldiers who may have done something bad directly, their home government should, of course, pull them out and send them to the courts.
I would go one step further, not just the home government. Look, for some countries who have much larger armies than they can afford, UN peacekeeping missions are actually a way of subsidizing and paying for their armies. I know that the reason why Bangladesh hasn't had a coup for many years is because they've been told that if they have a coup, they will not be able to have large numbers of troops in peacekeeping missions. So the army is kind of avoiding a coup completely. So very frankly, because it means money. You see, they get paid in dollars when they serve abroad. So when their troops are involved, then there should be some kind of penalty on that army as well in terms of the benefits they get from peacekeeping. But look, peacekeeping is becoming a problem in terms of finding countries that have large enough armies to spare to give for peacekeeping. And then these guys who go there, sometimes it's at the highest and the most organized level. Heather, I agree with you. There are at least two cases right now. One was the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's also this whole business of Haiti, where there is all these, and the two countries involved there, one of them rather dear to my heart, the army, apparently the commanders created a whole mechanism for a money-making scheme in which everybody got a share of the money. But then all you do is you find two people and you punish them, and you don't actually inflict any cost on the institution that was responsible for doing that. I think mechanisms do have to be found out for that, and there has to be a penalty. I agree that human beings are tempted to be criminal, but let's be honest, the reason why they are stopped, most people are stopped from being criminal, is the fear of penalty.
No, the government have to stand up for these values. Last month, the ambassador of Philippines came and he brought to me, brought to my attention a case that was happening in Erbil. Immediately, I sent it to the Minister of Interior, and the guy was arrested. He was from a Middle Eastern country. He came there, and when we started to look for him, they said, oh, he's an investor. Said, we don't care what is he is, this is a crime. And we brought him, put him in jail, and we told him, would you do that in your country? So that's why it has to be brought to the attention of the government, and the governments have to deliver and to play by the rules.
Sabrina Sakib from Afghanistan. It's, well, the case of some countries are very specific, like Afghanistan, where the resources of funding for terror is very clear. Ambassador Haqqani has mentioned that, for example, ISI, the military of Pakistan, is the biggest source of financing Taliban in Afghanistan. And also, like drug is another issue. Drug had been tackled, addressed many times by the international community. There was lots of pressure on the Afghan government to control it. But the issue of military of Pakistan have never been discussed, never been pushed on, while they are receiving most of the money, like the war economy goes to the military of Pakistan. So the people back in Afghanistan question the honesty of the policymakers of the world, that how can we trust if they do not, you know, band the resources, the funding of terroristic groups back in Afghanistan, which is #1, military of Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and some part Iran. But Pakistan as the main ally of United States in fighting terrorism in Afghanistan. So how do we address these questions? How can we bring the people's trust back to the policies of the world's leader, that we are honest in fighting terrorism in the areas that are in conflict?
Sabina, I alone probably have written more words about Pakistan's role in Afghanistan than the rest of the world put together. So look, here's the problem. The problem is that the US in particular has not yet been able to find a solution to bad allies. It knows how to deal with enemies, it knows who to bomb. And that it knows how to deal with good enemies, it knows who to invite to lunch. They don't know how to deal with difficult allies who perform certain functions of alliance, but on others are difficult. And now the tendency seems to me, under this administration in particular, to totally eliminate the concept of state sponsors of terrorism. Previously, that was something that put some fear of God in governments that were helping. But now with the Iran deal, etc., the presumption is that you can be a state sponsor of terror and yet have no consequences to face.
Let's not go very philosophical about that. We need transparency and good governance. This is what you need to empowering women, educating the society, encouraging the civil society, raising these issues in the media so that the community is aware of. Let's not throw the blame on others. We are part of the problem. We have to commit ourselves to these values and principles so that we work upon them.
We have someone in the audience from the banking side of the house. Selena, give us your insights and question, please.
Sure. I'm Selena Raulio. I'm a professor at the National Defense University, where I do a lot of teaching, preaching, and more importantly, research on this convergence of terrorism and crime. One thing that wasn't brought up in the conversation, for those who don't really follow it, we actually very actively now use financial intelligence to know the adversary better. And I thought General Allen expressed it in such a fantastic way of the three spheres in which we're attacking groups like ISIL, which is the physical, the financial, and then the cyber or the information piece. But it's one thing that did not come up also in the conversation is all of these heinous acts, it's because there's supply and demand, but also there's a culture, and more importantly, the condition that's the basis of all these crimes is really corruption and weak governance. And unfortunately, we spend a lot of time looking at what we call equip and train, and particularly investing a lot in the military as opposed to law enforcement. And the law enforcement, sadly, in many of these countries is so underpaid. It's actually either the Mexican cartels or the terrorist groups or smuggling networks like the Haqqani network, your cousins, Ambassador Haqqani,
not related.
who can actually be the employers, sadly, of these people who control what we call the global supply chains. So your thoughts on how we can really incorporate anti-corruption measures, but more importantly, hold people accountable. And Mrs. McCain and I talked about this, how thank God in the United States we've actually made, there's an act, an actual law that helps to protect the victims of human trafficking and making them not the blame. They actually get an amnesty to stay in the United States. And then it's from those conversations and those interviews that we learn more about these networks in order to better attack them. So how do we think about corruption? And I'm sure you have wonderful thoughts, Ayman, in terms of that.
Recently, with the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN enacted, for the first time, one of the main items is access to information becoming one of the goals to achieve. It's still a UN principle, so we know that the actual implementation will not be that easy. But there should be a very strong advocacy from all civil society, commitment from governments, funding going to actually translating this access to information into reality. It's only when light is shed on where the problems are and people have actual data to hold people accountable, to ask questions to their government, that we can do something. And when it comes, for example, to the financial markets, it was fascinating for me as a Lebanese in a country that doesn't have a president for 18 months and where the parliament hasn't convened for 18 months, is that basically the international community and mainly the financial instruments pushed the Lebanese parliament to convene just one time last week just to pass legislation related to trafficking, money laundering, and specifically funding terrorism, because there is a real fear that proximity plays a negative role. And Turkey, during the G20, also made new commitments related to banking transparency. We have to continue to watch these countries and push them to actually implement these principles.
Can I add something to that,
Certainly.
if I may? The demand side of this that we were talking about, there are several, as you know, several organizations and attempted organizations out there that are trying to work on supply chains and work on the global slavery index in general. Problem, and you made a perfect point about it, is that we don't have the data. There is no data that really exists specifically on the trafficking issue. That's a problem. We talked about it at dinner last night. We need hard data on this, and that's the McCain Institute is working on that a little bit, but it's going to be a long haul on that. And from the demand side, if I can add to that, we're talking about demands for goods. We're talking about demands for for all the other elements, but we need to talk about the demand for sex with children or with girls. This is everyone likes, all too often, in my opinion, likes to say that this is a woman's issue. This is by no means a woman's issue. This is a world issue. And so part of what we are trying to implement now is a worldwide organization of men, that men to men talking about this issue, and from the area that I work on in general. It has to be a global effort, though.
I have a question for you. So we're talking about disrupting the banking system, using the financial system to get to people. We've seen a series of attacks here that have been really low tech. The estimate is that the Paris attack cost $10,000 to execute. When you've got people self-radicalizing all around the world in their mom's basements and going out and buying a gun and creating mayhem, disrupting finances isn't going to do the whole job, is it?
No, it's about respect. It's about cultures learning to respect their little girls and their women. It's about, instead of making women and children commodities, they are indeed parts of society. It was talked about yesterday in this room about how we need to not only deal with that issue, but add women to the mix in the discussion. Your example of having the man as the head of the women's department is ludicrous. I mean, it really, things like that, in my opinion, on the level that I work.
You know, a combination of human rights organizations, women's organizations, and also parental monitoring. You can't. Children go out to the street, they beg. We have it in the poor countries, so they are vulnerable to be exploited any moment.
But if I understand your question correctly, it is how can you stop something like Paris just by disrupting finances? And my argument would be that you may not be able to stop Paris if it was totally about Paris, or if it's just about Belgium and the cell there. It is about global networks. And the biggest cost, for example, for the terrorist groups is providing the social services in the areas where they operate out of for legitimacy and also because they are the government, they are virtual government. And secondly, for training and recruitment. That is the highest amount that they spend on. And then
They do a lot of that on the internet. What does it take? An internet connection, a camera, a free Twitter account, a free Facebook account. That's not a high-ticket item for the way they're conducted.
But disrupting that is also not a high-ticket item if you actually are willing to do it. You can actually track it, stop it. You know, you have the technology and the technological means to do it. And basically, the other cost, for example, the reason why the 9/11 operation was $450,000 was because it involved finding people who could get a visa for the United States, getting them the documentation, getting them the backstory that would enable them to come to the US, getting them to get flight training, etc., etc. So that part can be stopped. And then the safe havens can definitely be disrupted by disrupting financing. Because can you imagine the Taliban retaining control before 9/11 if they didn't have money? Or ISIS being able to run that little mini state that they have. It's not so mini actually, it has more people in it than many states, many significant states around the world.
You have to kill the ideology, even if they don't have the money, the problem still remains.
Sure. But the money will make a difference there. And on the ideology too, the money does enable them to actually propagate the ideology. They were in, I mean, the Islamist groups had satellite TV stations long before you and I could actually talk to our own people through television channels in our own countries.
We have another question.
Tolu Ogunlesi from Nigeria. What I'm about to say might, I think, apply more to developing countries where there's a large amount of informalization of the economy. Sometime in September in Nigeria, there was a high-profile kidnapping of a former finance minister. And it turned out that when law enforcement got the kidnappers, they found about 24 SIM cards, phone cards, that had no biometric data on them. This coincided with a time when there was a deadline for all the telecoms companies to make sure that they registered all their users. And so, well, it led to the slamming of a $5 billion fine on MTN. You know, I think it's the biggest telecoms fine in the world so far. Now, that was August, September. In October 31 was a deadline by the central bank for banks to, for each account to have what they call a BVN, a bank verification number that ties all your accounts to your name. You know, of course, there will be issues about privacy, you know, those discussions, but I think that's another conversation entirely. But what happened was that the week after the BVN deadline, the volume of transactions on the foreign exchange market plummeted. And that's because people the bank said, the central bank said, if you wanted to exchange money, you had to submit your BVN. You know, so, but what this tells me is that Nigeria is finally waking up, you know, after to formalizing the economy, and that there's a direct impact between how much you know about who's using SIM cards, who's using bank accounts, and the confidence that people have for illegitimate transactions. And it might be a lesson, I guess, for other parts of the developing world that because I think I've come to know that it's not a lot of countries have like nationwide banking or mobile phone databases.
I think the basic point here is that most countries have some percentage of crime, and some part of their economy is the black economy. But if it's 10%, 15%, that's manageable. In countries like Nigeria, in countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan, the black economies are almost the same size as the formal economy. So in that sense, anything and everything you can do to make the economy more formal and less informal, I think is a good measure. And obviously, criminals will always continue to be innovative, and they'll come up with new ideas. Phone cards, prepaid phone cards have been a way for them to move money, etc. Every instrument that stolen credit cards, stolen debit cards, and so they will always be one step ahead in certain things. But I think that there can be an effort to try and have smaller informal economies and larger formal economies that may actually help bring all kinds of criminality and even support for terrorism a little down than it has been in the past.
We have a new banking system. We are just starting that system. What about the cash economy? So the system of governance, going back to the issue of the corruption, fighting corruption, proper management of the funds. In Iraq, billions of dollars have disappeared. We don't know what happened to them.
13 billion, according to one report, yeah.
More than that. So lots of billions have disappeared in Iraq. That's why we have to make sure that we have good governments, that they take care of the public funds and spend it for the right purposes. Second, we need training and capacity building of our police, of the law enforcement authorities. For example, we did not have, a few years ago, we did not have issue of drugs. But now we are confronting that. Our police need to be trained with that. So with fraud, with forged passports, there are lots of ways that the NATO, the United States, Canada, and others can come and help us so that the law enforcement authorities have been trained or are being trained in order to face these challenges.
Biometrics, for example, has definitely diminished the potential for passport fraud. I mean, previously you could just change the picture, etc. Now with biometrics, it becomes less and less likely, although the number of countries that are still outside the biometric regime is still staggering. And
the most dangerous countries. Yeah. And the most problematic countries.
Yeah. But some problematic countries have come into the biometric regime, and that has helped.
While we're on the issue of technology, I'm reading a lot about Bitcoin and that being used. Have any of you seen any evidence that Bitcoin is becoming a factor in all this?
Well, just a few months ago, a document was uploaded actually on the Surface Internet called Bitcoin wa Sadaqat al-Jihad. It's a very detailed explanation by an ISIS supporter to anyone who is ready to help ISIS. A very detailed explanation, a how-to manual, basically, on how to transfer money to ISIS through Bitcoins. Now, definitely, because it's dark, there is no way right now to quantify whether people are using it, but at least the manual, the how to do it, is right now available online.
Oh, good. We have another question right here.
My name is Bayan. I'm from Kurdistan region in Iraq. 2 points, well, 1 point and 1 question. I think the issue of justice or punishment is really important. I know it's been raised, but banks that help to launder money need to be closed down, not just have little penalties and for their directors to retire and go on a lecture tour. We need to have real, clear punishment and justice system. My question actually to everybody in the panel is the role of poverty. What is the role of poverty in financing terrorism, in human trafficking, in money laundering, in selling oil?
Well, poverty is the source. This is where they address them. That's why I said the developing and underdeveloped countries are the ones that are more vulnerable to this. And of course, justice needs to be established. Otherwise, this would be of no avail.
Poverty is mainly a way also to maintain population under control. However, huge problems in terms of plotting, in terms of executing many of these acts, in terms of designing financial schemes in order to transfer money, are developed by extremely wealthy people or people who are well off. So definitely poverty is a factor that increases the risk, but recently with most of the terrorist cases, the link between the execution of terrorism and poverty, I think, has decreased quite significantly.
Well, and Osama bin Laden was not a poor man.
Yeah.
And we already saw Ayad al-Baghdadi's watch. I want one like that, by the way, if anybody will give it to me.
Maybe your wife, you gave her a diamond. Maybe
yes, poverty is important in the sense of the victims,
yeah,
not the perpetrators. The perpetrators actually sometimes are rich people who want to become even richer by whatever they're doing, especially in child trafficking, etc. You have some of these people in Southeast Asia who run these child trafficking rackets who are actually rich gangsters who think of this as just another income stream, and they get into it.
But they co-opt the local populations because the local populations are so desperate.
The victims are poor, and so poverty does play a role.
I want to make one point. We all have heard about the Yazidis have suffered. We have some who have been rescued and they live in post-trauma situation. They're suffering. The whole world knew about them, but we are asking all our friends in the international community, the International Commission, please come and help them. That's why the reaction from the world is not that much as well. When there are people who are suffering and we call all of them to come and help them, they don't help. That's why the problem is we have to act when there is need to be.
What about the nation states? What about Iran? What about Saudi Arabia?
What about them?
And the money that they have funneled over the years?
Yeah, well, we've already discussed that, I think. We have already spoken about how the fact that, especially under President Obama, the concept of the state sponsor of terrorism has kind of declined. There's a notion that, you know what, we really can't do much with this idea, so might as well dispense with it. I think it's a great idea to have that designation, if for no other reason, because it limits the capability if it doesn't finish it. So yes, Iran has been a major contributor. Yes, other countries in the Arab region have also been, in the Middle East have also been major contributors. And then there are private citizens in these countries who also are, especially in Saudi Arabia, who are big contributors because they share the belief system. So they think they are doing religious charity by writing checks to them. Sadqat al-jihad, as the term he used, meaning you know, the charity of jihad. You're funding all of this in the name of God.
Let's take another question.
Let me just share this piece of information recently published by the Institute of Economics and Peace. And it says that you have to see two types of terrorism. One, the one that is originated in core countries such as Syria and Iraq. And then the other grassroots movements that you can find in countries such as the European countries and so forth. So what it says there is that terrorism is not actually correlated to poverty in the core countries. It is correlated with criminal activity. It is correlated with instability in the government and so forth, other factors. However, in countries such as France or such as the European countries, exclusion can be a factor, inequality, lack of opportunities there, which doesn't give you Osama bin Laden's probably, but will give you lone wolves or will give you other types of terror. I just wanted to comment that.
Sure, that was an important comment. One thing I would like to say before we end is that it's not just the Middle Eastern criminal gangs or the Southeast Asian criminal gangs involved in child trafficking. The Balkan criminal gangs and the East European criminal gangs have become the world's biggest suppliers of weapons. And they can get weapons delivered anywhere. So here's the model. You engage in child trafficking to raise money or drug trafficking, and then you use that money with the criminal gangs in Eastern Europe or the Balkans and get weapons from them and they have the capability to deliver weapons everywhere. So that really reinforces my original point about the need for greater global law enforcement than exists right now.
We have one more question over here.
I'm Air Vice Marshal Kevin Short from New Zealand. We're talking about enslaving women, we're talking about selling of drugs, we're talking about black markets. To me, there's a whole series of tentacles that go into funding terrorist activity. It's almost like you are doing great work at, I guess, the symptom and not the cause. And so my question is, how do you feel about the fact that you are working in one particular area, knowing there's all these tentacles? You might stop, cut off a couple of those tentacles, but the root cause is still there. And I just want to get a sense of how you feel about the real cause not being stopped.
Well, I agree with you, but you've got to start someplace. And I believe in helping my fellow mankind, and I believe what we're doing is the right thing to do. Will it fix the issue? Probably not, but I'm not going to go down without trying. I'll be honest with you. I also think that unless we encourage the world community to concentrate on this and work together, I think we really can do something that will be extraordinarily effective, but not without the entire involvement of the world community in a major way. But no, I do what I told my kids. You can't, not try, you got to try.
But organized crime in North America is much less today than it was, say, for example, in the days of prohibition. So obviously, one could argue that prohibition was the root cause, but the tentacles went well into the 1960s and 70s. So you do have to deal with the tentacles, and sometimes the tentacles will lead you to the cause. Creating a philosophical model of what the cause is and then trying to look for it may not necessarily be the way to deal with the problem.
And it's also, whatever is happening in the Middle East is a result of a total failure to end the war in Syria or to prevent the war in Syria from reaching the horrible state it is in today. It's an international failure, it's a local failure to protect the Syrian people when this protection could have still been possible. And when we look at some symptoms, for example, in March, the EU imposed sanctions on one middleman between ISIS and the Assad regime involved in smuggling oil. He was Christian. So this whole thing, again, about the Assad regime protecting minorities or ISIS going after Christians can also be turned or proven false by actual things that are happening on the ground. It's a failure of policy as well.
No, there are too many reasons, of course, going back to the deep-rooted roots and causes of these problems. But it would be a good idea if we can have sisterships, a country in the developed world to sister with a country in the underdeveloped or developing, helping them to bring about equal opportunities, social justice, good governance, rule of law. These are the ways to do it.
We are just about out of time. I had asked each of you to come up with your #1 prescription for what could be done in your area to try and get a handle on this. Quickly. Ambassador, you want to start?
Strengthening global law enforcement and creating the kinds of partnerships in law enforcement that already exist in military cooperation.
Raising the awareness and more cooperation and coordination.
More cooperation, obviously, not rewarding bad behavior. And may I also toss in there, I would love to see a female the head of the UN. I just think it'd be a good idea for a change.
Inclusive solution to the war in Syria, an inclusive approach to fighting terrorism that also includes some of the developers, the Bitcoin developers, those who are right now off the scene because they are not very happy with how Western governments work. There should be a way of all working together and finding a solution.
Thank you all for joining us. Ambassador Haqqani, Minister Mustafa, Mrs. McCain, Ayman, thank you all. Appreciate it. And thank you for being a great audience. Peter von Prague wants to say a few words.
I want to begin by thanking Jean, thanking this panel, this fantastic panel. I want to thank all of our speakers and all of our panelists over the weekend. We really had some very, very important conversations. A lot of work goes into putting on Halifax International Security Forum. I don't have time to thank everybody, but I'm quite sure that your experience here was touched by some of our volunteers. We've got over 60 young people volunteering from the Halifax area, and I just want to give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. I want to thank Minister McKay for his service to Canada and service to the world, and for his leadership for bringing Halifax International Security Forum to Halifax, Canada, and frankly into the world. It's a very important meeting, and these conversations, sadly, frankly, are more important than ever. I want to thank Minister Sajjan, Minister Hare, Minister Bryson for their leadership and for taking Halifax International Security Forum forward into the future. I want to thank mostly all of our participants. We, of course, can't do Halifax International Security Forum without you, your insight, your experience, your leadership, your effort to travel here. We've had huge delegations from all around the world, from 60 countries. Halifax, Nova Scotia is, it's close to get from some places, but it's not easy to get to from all places, and I really want to thank everybody for making the effort to come here and join us for this important weekend. Thank you. The conversations this weekend, frankly, I found were more pointed and more important than ever, and I just encourage everybody to stay in touch with each other, take the ideas that were generated here and bring them into your own positions, and hopefully this year, next time, we'll have more good news to share with the world. Thanks so much, and safe home. Thank you.